At 7:42 a.m. on March 14, 1941, Beatrice Schilling stood on the tarmac of RAF Kenley, watching a hurricane pilot climb into the cockpit for a mission that could well be his last. At 32 years old, with 6 years of service at the Royal Aircraft Establishment under her belt, she still hadn't cracked the problem that was killing Britain's fighter pilots. That week, the Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters across the English Channel. RAF pilots had tangled with them in 27 separate dogfights, losing 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires in the process. The pattern of these losses was chillingly consistent. A British pilot spots a German fighter, pushes his plane into a dive to attack, and then his engine cuts out cold. The German fighter either escapes unscathed or, worse, loops back to rake the stalled Hurricane with gunfire, while the pilot fights frantically to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Schilling had pored over every combat report, scoured maintenance logs, and interviewed pilots who cheated death after their engines failed mid-dive. The culprit was clear. The carburetor flooded during negative G maneuvers. It was a case of simple physics with brutal, deadly consequences. When a Spitfire or Hurricane nosed into a sudden dive, gravity reversed, sending fuel surging into the top of the float chamber. The engine starved of fuel and died for a mere 1.5 seconds. But those 1.5 seconds were all a Bf-10-9 pilot needed to close 300 yards and open fire. The Germans faced no such issue. Their Daimler-Benz engines relied on direct fuel injection, with no float chamber to flood. Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, and even invert their aircraft without losing a single beat of engine power, giving them a decisive edge in every aerial engagement. British pilots knew this flaw all too well. German pilots exploited it ruthlessly. Squadron commanders filed report after report about the deadly carburetor glitch, and the RAF was losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could churn out new ones. Schilling had been grappling with this problem for 11 long months. Rolls-Royce's engineering teams were developing a pressure carburetor, a permanent fix that would require a full redesign of the fuel delivery system. But it wouldn't be ready until 1943, possibly even 1944. The war couldn't wait that long, and neither could the pilots. Every morning, young men climbed into the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing their own engines might kill them before the Germans ever got the chance. Squadron leader Davies walked past Schilling toward the waiting Hurricane. At 24, he already had 41 combat missions under his belt and 3 confirmed kills to his name. He'd reported engine failure twice in the past month, both times during combat dives, and survived only by sheer luck in 3,000 hours of rigorous training. He nodded at Schilling as he passed. She nodded back. He had no idea she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. To him, she probably looked like someone's secretary. If you want to learn how Schilling's breakthrough turned the tide for RAF pilots, hit that like button. It helps us share more of these forgotten World War II stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. Now back to Schilling's desperate mission. That morning at Kenley, she'd brought something with her, a small, precisely machined brass component, deceptively simple in its design. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 straight weeks, and it worked flawlessly in controlled conditions. But bench tests were a far cry from combat. Combat meant flying at 300 miles per hour, enduring negative G-forces strong enough to pin a pilot to his harness, and staring down death in the span of 1.5 seconds. Schilling walked over to her Norton motorcycle, her leather satchel holding not just the brass restrictor, but a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force or end her career at Farnborough. By noon, she would know which. The carburetor crisis had first reared its head in July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. The higher octane rating delivered more boost, pushing the Merlin engine's output from 1,100 to 1,310 horsepower. The Spitfire Mark II could now hit 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch a Bf-109. But the Skinner's Union carburetor couldn't handle the extreme negative G-forces of high-speed combat maneuvering. Schilling knew carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, just 1 month after Britain declared war on Germany. She was one of only 2 women in the engine department. The other was a secretary, and she held the title of Principal Technical Officer, leading carburetor research and development. Most of the men she worked with had never met a female engineer. Some didn't even believe women belonged in the field. But Schilling didn't care about their opinions. She cared about keeping pilots alive. Her passion for engines had started young. At 14, she'd bought her first motorcycle, a Norton, and stripped its two-stroke engine down to its individual parts, learning every detail of how it worked before rebuilding it from scratch. At 25, she'd raced that very Norton at Brooklands, averaging 106 miles per hour to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club's Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had ever claimed that award. Schilling was the second. Racing had taught her to feel how engines failed under stress, the strain of high G turns, sudden acceleration, and extreme lean angles. She could sense an engine's needs before the gauges ever registered a problem, an intuition that made her Britain's top carburetor specialist. And now British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't keep up with the brutal demands of combat. The solution hit her in January, another lesson in simple physics. The float chamber flooded because fuel flowed unrestricted when gravity reversed during a dive. What if she restricted that flow? Not enough to starve the engine, but just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get the fuel it needed, just not the excess that caused the deadly stall. The answer was a brass disc with a precisely calibrated hole drilled through its center, installed in the fuel line just before the carburetor. It would limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. Schilling machined the first restrictor herself. It was shaped like a brass thimble, 0.125 inches in diameter, with a 0.04-inch hole in the middle. Those dimensions were non-negotiable. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood; too small, and the engine would starve at full power. She tested 17 different sizes before landing on the perfect one, then simplified the design to a flat washer, easier to manufacture, easier to install, and easier to replace if damaged. Bench tests proved it worked, stopping fuel flooding during simulated negative G conditions. But Schilling needed to test it on a real aircraft, in real combat conditions. The problem? Getting permission. Installing an unauthorized modification on an RAF fighter violated at least 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Schilling would face a court-martial, possibly even prison time. So she made a bold choice. Ask for forgiveness later, not permission now. That morning at Kenley, her satchel held 6 restrictors, and she had an ally in Sergeant William Cooper, a ground crew member who owed her a favor. Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years and watched 19 pilots die because of the carburetor flaw. When Schilling showed him the brass washer, he didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and grabbed his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad, pilot inside, engine warming up. 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked fast. Disconnect the fuel line between the pump and carburetor, slide the restrictor into place, and weld it secure with a small butane torch. The whole job took 60 seconds, and the modification was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Schilling inspected the weld. Clean, solid, professional. Squadron leader Davies would be flying with the restrictor that day, and he had no idea it was there. Schilling hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation. Just a dead pilot and a brass washer that never should have been installed. The Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies ran through his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature stable, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes, and the plane rolled forward, gathering speed before lifting off the tarmac. Schilling watched it climb, 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet, before banking south toward the English Channel. She'd brought a pair of binoculars, tracking Davies as he climbed to 15,000 feet. 2 more Hurricanes joined him, forming a section of 3, flying the standard patrol formation toward Dungeness, a spot where German fighters had been active all week. If Davies encountered a Bf-109, he'd have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. Schilling waited on the tarmac with Cooper, neither of them saying a word. Around them, ground crew prepared 2 more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled past, and mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area, all the normal sounds of a fighter station at war. But Schilling didn't hear any of it. She was running fuel flow calculations through her head. 0.04-inch hole, Maximum flow at full throttle, 1.5 seconds of negative G. The math checked out, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. Radio silence from Davies' section. It could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters, a fight too intense to send a report, or a crashed hurricane scattered across a French field. At 9:37 a.m., the radio crackled to life with the controller's voice. 3 hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling raised her binoculars. There they were, 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft, no losses. The hurricanes entered the landing circuit, with Davies touching down first. He taxied back to the dispersal pad, cut the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. Schilling walked toward him, her hands shaking. She'd designed bombs before, tested engine modifications in laboratory settings, but she'd never done anything like this, installing an unauthorized part and sending a pilot into combat to test it. Davies pulled off his helmet, and to Schilling's shock, he was smiling. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. Not usually. They looked exhausted, haunted. But Davies looked positively excited. Cooper was the first to speak, his voice tight with anticipation. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Schilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." Schilling asked him to describe exactly what happened. He'd spotted 2 Bf-10-9s at 14,000 feet, both flying east toward France. Davies had positioned his section above them, gaining an altitude advantage, then pushed the Hurricane into a steep dive, hitting 400 miles per hour with negative G-forces strong enough to lift him out of his seat against the harness straps. It was the exact maneuver that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin kept running, at full power, the entire time. Davies closed to 200 yards before the German pilot spotted him, fired a 3-second burst, and watched strikes hit the left Bf-10-9's wing root. The German fighter broke hard right and fled for France. Davies pulled up and climbed back to altitude, the engine performing flawlessly. It was the first time in 11 months he'd successfully executed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Schilling told him the truth. She explained the restrictor, the brass washer, the way it limited fuel flow to prevent flooding. Davies stared at her for 5 long seconds, then turned to Cooper. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station," he said. "Today." Schilling tried to explain that the modification wasn't authorized, but Davies didn't care about regulations. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenley had lost friends to the carburetor flaw, 19 dead in 6 months. Davies said if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized part, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed engines that worked. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. Schilling had brought 6. She kept 1 for further testing. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the restrictors and recorded 0 engine failures. They executed 12 diving attacks against German fighters, all successful. Pilots reported that the Merlin engines ran perfectly, better than perfectly, some claimed, with more power at altitude than ever before. Word spread like wildfire. By March 18th, every squadron commander and 11 group knew about the restrictor, and they all wanted it immediately. Schilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. Could she come to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be manufactured? The new problem was supply. Schilling had machined the 6 restrictors herself in the RAE workshop. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, brass stock, precision machining equipment, and quality control. She needed approval from the Air Ministry, funding, and time. She got the approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry labeled it a war-winning modification and fast-tracked her proposal. Rolls-Royce landed the production contract, churning out 500 restrictors per week. Installations began immediately at every fighter station in Britain. Schilling assembled a small team, 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics. Their mission was to tour RAF stations and oversee installations, and crucially, the restrictor could be fitted without taking aircraft out of service. That was a game changer. The Battle of Britain was technically over, but German fighters crossed the Channel daily, and RAF Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons for a single day. Schilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors. She'd visited 43 RAF stations before the war. She knew every fighter base in southern England, every commanding officer, every ground crew member. Now she'd visit them again, armed with a brass washer that would save lives. By March 25th, installation teams were ready to roll. 600 restrictors manufactured, 40 stations on the schedule, 3,000 Merlin engines waiting to be modified. Schilling kicked off the tour by heading north to Biggin Hill, the busiest fighter station in 11 Group, home to 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, and 4 squadrons rotating through nonstop combat operations. She arrived at 8 a.m. on March 26th, and Station Commander Group Captain Grace met her at the gate. He'd lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months and demanded the restrictors be installed immediately. Ground crews worked in round-the-clock shifts, modifying 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took just 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line, weld the restrictor in place, reconnect the line, test for leaks. The weld had to be perfect. A faulty joint at altitude could starve the engine completely. Schilling supervised every single installation personally, inspecting every weld, testing every connection, and rejecting 3 restrictors that didn't meet her strict specifications. Pilots watched the modifications with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey had 41 combat missions under his belt and had experienced engine failure twice, both times during critical moments in dogfights. He asked Schilling how a simple washer could solve such a complex carburetor problem. She broke it down for him. Fuel flow physics, float chamber dynamics, the effects of negative G on liquid fuel. Lacey, a Cambridge-educated engineer, called it brilliant simplicity. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Schilling moved on to Hornchurch, then North Weald, then Tangmere, and the pattern repeated at every station. Ground crews pulled 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew combat patrols with modified engines. 0 engine failures were reported. The restrictor worked exactly as designed. Pilots soon started calling it Miss Schilling's Orifice. The nickname was coined by Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce's supercharger division. A bit of crude British humor, slightly inappropriate, but Schilling didn't mind. She'd spent 6 years working with RAF personnel and knew how military men coped with the stress of war. If a silly nickname helped them remember the modification that kept them alive, she'd answer to anything. The moniker spread faster than the restrictor itself. By April, every pilot in fighter command knew about Miss Schilling's Orifice, and they requested it by name. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification installed, and squadron commanders backed them up. They'd seen too many good men die because of a preventable flaw. German intelligence was quick to notice the shift in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April noted that RAF pilots were now executing diving attacks with confidence, no longer breaking off pursuit during negative G maneuvers. Bf 109 pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had vanished entirely. By mid-April, Schilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. Every Hurricane and Spitfire in fighter command, every operational training unit, every reserve aircraft. The restrictor became standard equipment. New Spitfires and Hurricanes rolling off the production lines at Castle Bromwich in Southampton came with the brass washer pre-installed. Rolls-Royce's pressure carburetor was still in development, with production slated for 1943. But the restrictor worked so well that some engineers questioned whether the pressure carburetor was even necessary. Why redesign an entire fuel system when a 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? Schilling knew the answer. The restrictor was a stopgap, a brilliant one, but temporary. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the negative G problem entirely, with no fuel flow restrictions, no power limitations, and full engine performance under any flight condition. That was the proper engineering solution. But until 1943, Miss Schilling's Orifice would keep RAF pilots alive, and that was more than enough. The results were impossible to ignore. Fighter command tracked combat statistics with meticulous precision, and the numbers told a clear story. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters suffered engine failures in 38% of all diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots were forced to break off pursuit, letting enemy fighters escape, or worse, falling prey to German pilots who deliberately lured them into dives, knowing their engines would fail. In April 1941, after the restrictor was installed, engine failures during diving attacks plummeted to just 0.4%, nearly non-existent. The few failures that did occur were unrelated to the carburetor: mechanical breakdowns, battle damage, the normal attrition of war. The kill-to-loss ratio improved dramatically. March had been a bloodbath. Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat, shooting down 61 German aircraft, a meager 1.3 to 1 ratio, barely breaking even. April was a different story. Just 29 British fighters lost compared to 94 German aircraft destroyed, a staggering 3.2 to 1 ratio. The restrictor wasn't the only factor, but squadron commanders credited it as a major contributor to the turnaround. Pilots reported a newfound confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, who flew Spitfires out of Duxford, had experienced engine failure 4 times before the restrictor. After installation, he executed diving attacks without hesitation, destroying 3 Bf-10-9s in May and 2 more in June. He credited the brass washer with giving him the courage to fly aggressive tactics. The modifications soon spread beyond Fighter Command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Beaufort fighters. Bomber Command wanted them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm inquired about installing them on carrier-based fighters. Schilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce, and by June, the factory was churning out 1,000 restrictors per week. The brass washer remained in service through 1943, when Rolls-Royce finally introduced the pressure carburetor in January. The new carburetor used fuel injection principles similar to the German engines, with no float chamber to flood and perfect fuel delivery under any condition. But converting existing aircraft to the pressure carburetor required extensive work. Removing the old carburetor, installing new fuel pumps, rewiring engine controls. Each conversion took 8 hours, during which time the aircraft couldn't fly combat missions. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons for extended maintenance, so the restrictors stayed. Many aircraft flew with Miss Schilling's Orifice until 1944, some even until the end of the war. Newly built Spitfires and Hurricanes got the pressure carburetor, but older planes kept the brass washer. Pilots trusted it, ground crews knew how to maintain it, and as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Schilling moved on to other critical projects after the restrictor's success. She developed cold weather starting systems for engines deployed in Iceland and Russia, researched high-altitude fuel mixture problems, and helped design improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy with dozens of technical challenges, each one a matter of life and death for pilots. Her personal life remained separate from her work. She'd married George Naylor in September 1938. He worked at the RAE as an aerodynamicist, and when war broke out, he volunteered for RAF Bomber Command, flying Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron on 31 combat missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing an extra tour beyond his required duty. Schilling worried about him every time he took off. She knew Bomber Command suffered higher casualties than any other RAF branch, with 1 in 2 crew members failing to survive the war. But Naylor beat the odds, returning to Farnborough in 1944. They never talked about his missions, and he never asked about her projects. They kept work and marriage in separate, carefully guarded compartments. When time permitted, Schilling still rode her Norton motorcycle. She'd stopped racing at Brooklands when the war began. The famous circuit had been converted to aircraft production facilities. But she still loved riding fast, the thrill of speed a welcome escape from the stress of war. By 1945, she'd worked on 17 major projects at Farnborough. Cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization, supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each project saved lives. Each kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions. But none achieved the fame of the humble brass restrictor. The war ended in May 1945, with Germany's surrender, followed by Japan's surrender in August. The Royal Aircraft Establishment shifted from wartime emergency projects to peacetime research, a slower pace, lower urgency, different priorities. But Schilling stayed at Farnborough. Engineering was her life, and she had no intention of leaving. In 1948, she received official recognition for her wartime contributions when King George VI appointed her an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE. The ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. Schilling wore a formal dress, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, and was back at work at Farnborough the very next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the RA spanned another 21 years, but she never rose to the top administrative positions. Those roles were reserved for men. A glass ceiling the RAF leadership refused to shatter, no matter her accomplishments. Schilling accepted this limitation without complaint. She preferred hands-on engineering work anyway, the thrill of solving real problems with real solutions. Her post-war projects included the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile, where she worked on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude performance. She also researched wet runway braking effects for jet aircraft. By the 1950s, landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures, and understanding how water on runways affected tire friction was critical to saving lives. Schilling published 3 technical papers on the subject. She even helped design a bobsled for the RAF's Olympic team, a quirky project for an aeronautical engineer, but one that drew on her expertise in aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management. The RAF team used her design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. Schilling retired in 1969 at the age of 60. In retirement, she restored vintage motorcycles, raced occasionally at classic motorcycle events, and kept her beloved Norton in immaculate condition. The same motorcycle she'd bought in 1934, the same one she'd raced at Brooklands, the same one that had taught her everything she knew about engines under stress. She passed away on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81, survived by her husband George and a lifetime of extraordinary engineering achievements. The British newspaper obituaries focused on the restrictor, the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice. Everything else she'd accomplished was little more than a footnote, but her legacy lived on in unexpected ways. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum purchased her racing trophies and badges. In 2018, Winchester Heritage celebrated her as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Schilling Building for electronic engineering students, and on March 8th of that same year, 110 years after her birth, the mayor of Waterville unveiled a plaque honoring her at the local library. The restrictor itself became a staple of engineering education, studied in universities worldwide as a masterclass in elegant problem-solving under pressure. A simple solution, implemented immediately, with measurable life-saving results. Everything good engineering should be. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, summed it up years later. Beatrice Schilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. The restrictor was a war-winning modification, and the woman who designed it was a hero in every sense of the word, even if she never sought the recognition. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about engineers who saved lives with brass washers and brilliant thinking, about real people and real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Texas? Germany? Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. And you're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the war. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Beatrice Schilling doesn't disappear into silence. She deserves to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.